So, some of you have sung this song before. I thought, if you don't mind, if we could we're going to sing a little song first, to kind of an opening song to get us in the mood. This is the Revolutionary Alphabet. Did you see a copy of this already? Okay, so I don't want to. You'll catch the gist of it pretty quick as we sing here. So those of you who know, join in. It goes like this. A stands for Americans who never will be slaves. B is for Boston's bravery that ever freedom saves. C is for the Congress which though loyal will be free. D stands for defense against all force and tyranny. Stand firmly A to Z, we swear forever to be free. E stands for the evils which a civil war must bring. F stands for the dreadful fate for people and for kings. G's for George, may heaven grant him wisdom, health, and grace. H is for the hypocrites who wear a double face. Stand firmly A to Z, we swear forever to be free. J is for justice which the traitors now in power defy. K is the king again who should to such the axe apply. L's for London where he sits to honor ever true. M's for Mansfield who it seems doth hold another view. Stand firmly A to Z, we swear forever to be free. N is north who to the house the evil mandate brings. O's for oaths which seemingly find subjects not their kings. P stands for the people who their freedom would defend. Q stands for the question, when will England's troubles end? Stand firmly A to Z, we swear forever to be free. R stands for the rebels, not in Boston but at home. S stands for the Stuarts, sent by Whigs abroad to Rome. T stands for the Tories, who may try to bring them back. B stands for the villains who have well deserved the rack. Stand firmly A to Z, we swear forever to be free. W must stand for will to us from Warren say. Y for York the new, now half corrupted, half enslaved. Z we give to zero, which refers to Tory minions, who threaten us with fire and sword to bias our opinions. Stand firmly A to Z, we swear forever to be free. All right. With that, a round of applause for Samuel Adams.
Well, good evening. Mother said never to wear a hat indoors, so I hope you'll forgive me. We'll just put this little thing down. It's a pleasure to be here for a couple of reasons. One reason, with this COVID threat we've had, I haven't been able to do my talks for 6 months. And I've talked all over the area and beyond. We've been to Seattle to do a veterans group. We've been to Maine to do, believe it or not, a 5th grade class. Been to Austin, Texas, California, up and down the state of Utah, doing not only this, but I have a couple of other talks I do too. But this is the one I do in costume. It was designed to be done in elementary and junior high school and even big high schools, which I have done. I play the part of Samuel Adams. We will pretend this is a town hall meeting. I trust most of you are Patriots, I hope.
You're here.
If there's a few Tories out here, loyalists, welcome. Perhaps you'll learn something. I was born in 1722. Okay. I grew up in a large family. I was the oldest son of 13 siblings. My parents were devout Anglicans, as were most of the people who had immigrated from England to Boston. Mother wanted me to be a preacher. That didn't sit too well with me. My dad was a fairly successful brewmaster, and he wanted me to go into the family business. Taught me how to be a malter, making malt for the beer. And I didn't do well at that. I tried a little bit of marketing, merchandising. I failed at that. I even became, if you'll forgive me, a tax collector for the king. Yeah, no, we do this. Five. Okay. Fortunately, I was not convicted of any crime. My beloved father, I think he gave me 10,000 pounds and launched me on a career that I had no direction. Well, the first thing I did is I gave half of it to a friend as a loan, which he never repaid. And that would pretty much describe I just had no sense of value for wealth. I wanted to do something else. And as we moved the country, or actually the colonies, toward rebellion, the American Revolution, I found great success as a propagandist. Okay? In this side of the Atlantic, it was called the battle, the Revolutionary War. In England, it was the rebellion of those villainous people in North America. The French and Indian War in the 1750s, 60s was a world war. It was called the 7 Years' War. It lasted 10 or 11 years, but they called it the 7 Years' War. And the Patriots in the colonies actually wound up fighting alongside the English against the French. And they eventually prevailed. But it would have a lasting effect on what happened 20 years later. Now, one of the main antagonists for the loyal people in Boston to the Patriot cause was our friend King George III. And if you'll allow me to sit for some of this. King George assumed the throne in his young 20s. He was the third of the Hanover kings, but unlike the previous two, he was born in England, and English was his first language. Now, after he'd been king for about a year, Parliament decided he needed a wife. Okay, so he didn't have a whole lot to say about it. They went over and found some German duke who had a daughter who was 17 years old. Her name was Charlotte Mecklenburg-Strelitz. And they decided she would be a good match for the English king. So she was brought over, ladies, 17 years old. One morning she was introduced to the king. He said, "Yeah, she'll do." That afternoon they were married. Things were different back then. This guy, as much as we vilify him, and he was a different kind of a duck. Unlike most of the regents that were reigning around the world, he didn't have a lot of girlfriends. He didn't have concubines and mistresses. He was faithful to that woman. They had 13 children. 13. And I believe 11 survived. Of course, they had the best care the country could offer at the time. He was an eccentric individual. He spent half the money, half of his worldly wealth, he gave away to charity, or he spent on the arts and the sciences. He was largely responsible for building the big Herschel Observatory, which was famous in England at that time. They discovered a new planet, and it was named for him, George's star. But after he died, they changed the name to Uranus, the planet Uranus. Such a famous fleet, isn't it? Well, to really get started, I have to read you a proclamation, an address to the people of Boston. Good morning or afternoon, evening, citizens, draw near and hear my words. We are gathered here on the Boston Common this afternoon, to discuss recent events here in the province of Massachusetts Bay. The year is 1775. The month is April, late in April, in fact. Those have been troubled, if not compelling times. The cause for independence that has festered here in the New World for the last several decades has developed into open rebellion. I, as Samuel Adams, have called you here today so that we may look back at what has transpired to this point. It will be a long and bitter fight to create a new nation here in America, but with that challenge still ahead, I think it will do you well to take a few minutes and look back what has happened so far to date. As you know, for more than a century, we have lived under the yoke of tyranny from a government 3,000 miles across the sea to the east. The current regent, King George III, has saddled we colonists with a series of cruel laws and taxes while denying us any representation in the English Parliament. These have come to be known as the Intolerable Acts. So where do we begin? By the way, I believe I was the one that came up with the slogan, taxation, no representation, no taxation without representation. Became a watchword. Okay, let's move to the next one. In Boston, the reigning military officer was General Thomas Gage, the British governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay in 1775. Actually, he had been in charge of the Redcoats, the military that were occupying Boston for some years. And then he was recalled back to England. And then when things got hot over there in Boston, they sent him back over. And when he was there a while, they said, not only are you going to be the commanding officer of the military, you're going to be the new governor. So now he had two weighty issues to concern, okay? He was married to a beautiful woman, Margaret Kimball Gage. She was an American, remember that? She was an American. I think she was born in New York. Okay. They were living outside of Boston for a while, but as it became more dangerous for him, they found out that tax collectors and officers were being attacked on the street. Tax collectors were being tarred and feathered. Rocks were being thrown through windows. He was recalled into Boston proper. Okay, now at the time, there was about 1,250,000 people on the eastern seaboard of the United States, what would become the United States at that time, 13 colonies, okay? About a third of them were loyalists, sometimes called Tories. About a third of them were patriots, pushing for the cause of independence. And the other third, they much didn't care. They just sat on the sidelines and went about their business, mostly farmers out in the rural areas. But General Gage saw that the balance was shifting. There was more patriots coming on board from this cast of characters in the hinterland. Okay. Now, the king, he authorized taxes and laws. Okay, first you had the Sugar Act. Well, actually, way before that, there was one involving shipping. But the Sugar Act is one that struck a nerve because that restricted the trade of rum, which was a very valuable commodity in the colonies at that time. Then he put in something called the Quartering Act. Now, the Quartering Act said that a British soldier, English soldier, I should separate the two. The two were almost interchangeable, but the term British really wasn't used at the time. Most of the people that had immigrated to America had come from England, and they considered themselves more English than British. And it was just about this time that the term British started taking hold. But the British regulars, they could go up, knock on your door, ladies, and say, "Here I am." And you would be required to provide him a bed near the fire, victuals, which is food and meals, a certain measure of beer, and one single measure of rum per week. You had to supply him with a tin pot and a plate and silverware, and you probably had to wash his dishes, and hopefully he did his own laundry. By law, he was supposed to do his own laundry. Now, if you and your sisters are home, do you want this rough and scroungy road coming into your house? They spend a lot of time down on the docks in the spare time, chasing the working girls and drinking and rum soap. Most of them had been recruited off the docks in England somewhere. They were not first-class citizens. Now, the officers, which were held to a higher standard, they wore nicer uniforms. They still had red coats, but the officers' red coats were finely tailored and dyed a bright red. These guys, it was a rough sewn red coat, and it was dyed a darker red with a Spanish mutter dye. And so it was easy to tell the officers from the rogues that ran around dressed like this. The officers always found billeting with the loyalists. They said, "Oh, look, we have a young lieutenant. Sure, come on in." But if you had this guy, you didn't like that at all. Fortunately, as it worked out, there were several large warehouses down near the waterfront that were empty. And the English, the Brits, they had the foresight to billet most of these guys into those warehouses. And not many of them actually went out to live in your house, okay? You're happy about that, aren't you? Okay. I forgot to mention my beautiful bride sitting next to me. Her name is Elizabeth. She was my second wife, okay? My first wife's name was Elizabeth. So we didn't have to change the monogram on the underwear. Because I don't know how it works.
Good choice.
Anyway, my first wife, we had 6 children. The last one was stillborn, and sadly, she died. The wife died at the time of that stillborn birth. And several years later, after the 5 surviving children, only 2 of them survived. My son Samuel and my daughter Hannah. But I found another woman whose name was Elizabeth, and we were married, and we never had any children of our own, but this wonderful woman raised my 2 children from the first Elizabeth into adulthood, okay? In real life, this is my wife, Lucy. We've been married 60 years, okay? A really good catch. Okay. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier during the introduction. So now we are moving toward critical mass as far as the Patriots are concerned. We have an incident called the Boston Massacre. Actually, when it happened, it was called the Incident on King Street. It happened on March 5th, 1770. It was a snowy day. About 6 o'clock in the evening, two young boys, where are they? Sitting in the back row, those guys. They started throwing snowballs at a sentry who was posted in front of the customs house. I mean, this poor guy's out there and he's ducking snowballs. Well, about that time, all those dockyard workers who had gotten off about an hour before and made a round into all the pubs, so they're pretty liquored up, they come by and say, hey, this looks like fun. So not only did they start throwing snowballs, they start throwing lumps of coal and sticks and boards, anything they can get their hands on. So the guard, he sticks his head in the door, and he says, Lieutenant Thomas, I got a problem out here, you know? And so the lieutenant sends 7 more guys out. Now there's 8, plus the officer standing out there. And they're all there armed with their muskets. And now there comes a wave of snowballs and chunks of ice and everything else. And they all get their muskets down, and the officer puts his saber down and says, no, no. And then they start throwing more. And then there was one of the men, his name was Montgomery. He got hit with a big board in the chest, and the gun went off. Well, then the other 6 guys all fired. 5 American patriots were killed that day. The first one was a black man. His name was Crispus Attucks. One of the men actually survived the shooting but died 2 days later. He was taken off to the hospital. But the British government in charge said, okay, this happened. These men will be brought up on charges, but not in a British court or an English court. They would be brought up in the colonial court. And who was the man who was called upon as their solicitor, their lawyer? It was none other than John Adams, my second cousin. And one of the things he did is he went to the hospital and he found this wounded man. I think his name was Clay. And he wasn't doing too good. But he forgave the men who shot him. And he said they were obviously provoked. They should not be, you know, it's a hanging offense. You can't go out and shoot people. And so John Adams went into court for the first time, and it was the longest trial in the colonies to that point. He went in with hearsay testimony, what he had heard this man say in the hospital. And the judge accepted hearsay testimony for the first time in American courts. And the final verdict was 2 of the men, Montgomery and one other, were convicted and the others were set free. Now, by law, they should have been taken straight to the gallows. But there was an old archaic relic in the law, something called the benefit of clergy. And if you could get a clergyman to stand up for you, say you're a good guy, they can lessen the penalty. And of course, 2 clergymen did stand up and spoke well of these 2 soldiers who were obviously goaded into this. And so their lives were spared. But they did have to serve a penalty. They had to put their thumb out, and it had to be branded with the letter M for manslaughter. And they would carry that brand for the rest of their lives. But they were alive. I again must take credit for the term Boston Massacre. I came up with that several days later. Paul Revere, who was a metalsmith there in town, made an engraving. Here's our friend Paul. He made an engraving. It wasn't very accurate, but it depicted the Boston Massacre. I had given it the name Boston Massacre, and this, of course, inflamed the people. And they took that engraving and they're printing off handbills and sending them all up and down the coast. So Paul Revere, he was an interesting fellow. His father's name was Revlois. I think it was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow who wrote The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. That didn't sound very good. Fortunately, his name had been anglicized before he made his famous ride. Now, Longfellow he was a brilliant writer, but he wasn't a very good historian. If you read that poem, he will tell you that Paul Revere made it all the way to Concord and shouted out all along the way. No, he didn't. He got captured by a British patrol before he got to Concord. And he said other things like, when the clock struck 12 at midnight, the cock sounded. Roosters don't crow at midnight. Come on. Any farmer can tell you they crow when the sun comes up. So anyway.
But I think the moon was accurate.
There was a near full moon, but that usually doesn't attract the attention of a good rooster. Okay?
No, I'm saying that part of the poem was correct, I think. I think it was the fire. Isn't it mentioned in the moon?
Yeah. Well, anyway. Hey, I got another guy who's not too good a historian, but he's a great writer too. That'd be, Ralph Waldo Emerson. We'll talk about that guy later on.
So where are we?
Okay, Paul Revere became very influential, one of the beginners in a group that was founded as the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. Okay, now the Sons of Liberty get all the press, but those gals were out there working too. In fact, one of the things, if you were a British officer and you'd wanted to come calling on one of the young ladies in town, if she was a patriot, if she was one of the families with the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, you'd get run off. Okay? Sorry, no British guys. Okay? They also started up sewing bees and weaving because our friend King George had put such a tariff, such a tax on printed cloth coming in. The Patriots wouldn't buy it. In fact, that was one of the problems. All these British goods kept coming in, and the Patriots they boycotted British goods. And back in Britain, those merchants who had invested heavily in the New World, they were getting skinned alive because nobody was buying anything. Why would we want to buy British tea and pay a tax on it when we can buy Dutch tea? But Dutch tea costs more. Yes, but the principle, we don't want to pay the tax, so we'll buy the Dutch tea. Well, then we move along. 3 more years, 3 years, is it? Yes. Okay. December 16th, 1773. Things are evolving. Okay. This was an incident that was called the destruction of the tea. Okay. The term Boston Tea Party didn't come into the American language for 60 years. 60 years! Okay? Some unknown revisionist came up with a catchy term, and now if you go to Boston, which is our most historic city, and everybody should go to Boston, incredible city. It's Boston Tea Party here, Boston Tea Party everywhere. Okay? It started in London when the East India Tea Company, which was really in bad shape financially, they cut a deal with King George. And he said, okay, I'll give you the exclusive rights to sell tea in the New World. So there were not 3 tea ships, as you may have been told. There were 7. And they were tied up to the docks in London, and they were taking on tea. Hundreds of crates of these tea. Where's that young fellow I called on? Are you back there, buddy? Come on up here. You got a part in this. Yeah. He's going to throw it, not till I tell you, though. And promise me you won't hit anybody. Okay? And take that flag off, you know, too. Yeah. Okay. There it is. Low grade. Low grade tea. Okay. The cases ran about 400 pounds. Well, this lad and the rest of them, they couldn't lift them, so they were in there hacking away with hatchets and axes and everything. But first the ships had to get to the New World. And here was the deal. When the ship arrived, the clock was ticking. The tax had to be paid within 20 days. Okay? The first of the 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, were bound for Boston Harbor. The Dartmouth got there on the 28th of November, pulled up to Griffin's Wharf. Paul Revere and his buddies, the Sons of Liberty, stood watch on the docks and said, nobody's going to unload that tea. Okay, so we're at a standoff. 4 days later, the Dartmouth pulls in. And about the same time, the Beaver pulls in, but there's a problem with the Beaver. Somebody on board has smallpox, so they wouldn't even let it come to the dock until the 15th. And now we have all 3 tea ships on the dock. But there's 4 more tea ships out there. The Nancy went to New York. But the Patriots, with this messaging system that Paul Revere had designed with circuit riders, they had already carried the message down. Pay no tax and unload no tea. And if it comes to the 20th day, at midnight on the 20th day, those ships got to go back to England. So nobody paid tax on the Nancy. Okay? The London pulled into Charleston, North Carolina. Same thing happened. In fact, they did unload the tea and set it on the end of the dock, but it never got any farther because nobody paid any tax on it, and it ended up rotting away. Okay? The Polly went to Philadelphia. They got the word, don't unload the tea, pay no tax. There was one other ship, the William. The William got caught in a gale and went on the rocks down at Cape Cod, pretty close to shore, and the ship started breaking up the next day. Now, also on these ships was other commerce. I know on the Beaver there was a lot of wooden furniture, okay? And the Patriots said, you can unload those other things, but don't unload the tea. So the furniture came ashore in Boston. The William was carrying, I believe over 100 lanterns for the streets of Boston. So there was a local magistrate down in Cape Cod who rallied the forces, and they started bringing about 57 tea ships. Well, there was 50 59 tea chests on that ship, and they rescued 52 of them. The others went down in the water. And they brought them ashore. And according to the plan, they were going to not let that tea go down to Boston. So they loaded it on a fast schooner, and it split out and landed on some island somewhere, and they unloaded the tea and locked it in the warehouse. No tax was ever paid on that tea, and it rotted away in a warehouse, okay? But they did salvage many of the lanterns for the city of Boston. No, we're not gonna throw it in yet. But that magistrate I told you about down there in Cape Cod, he figured, well, you know, I did a heck of a job. I rescued, you know, all these lanterns and stuff. He said, I think I'm entitled to a couple of boxes of tea, cases. So he did, and he put them in some wagons and he sent them south, North Carolina, down that way. And so there was actually a little bit of British tea swilled in some teacups on this side of the Atlantic Ocean, but no tax was ever paid on it. But he got tripped up. Somebody ratted him out. So he had to answer for charges, and he was tarred and feathered. Sounds terrible. It's gotta hurt. Hot tar and feathers. The people he sold the tea to, they were innocent. They had no idea. They didn't know it was contraband tea. So they were let go. But now we're closing in on the 20th day. Okay? We're going to get ready. Are you ready to throw that tea?
I've heard that the preference for coffee over tea in the United States goes all the way back to.
Goes back to the Green Dragon Tavern. I'll tell you about that in a little bit. We're going to throw the tea in the harbor. So there was about 70-some guys, and I believe 19 of them were teenagers. Most of them were under the age of 40. They blackened their faces with soot, put feathers in their hair, and I'm sorry I didn't bring a feather. I have it, but I didn't bring it. I didn't know there'd be youngsters here. And armed with axes and hatchets, they marched on to Griffin's Wharf about 6 o'clock in the evening on December 16th. And there were British ships all over the harbor, but they decided they'd stay back. They didn't want to fire into the crowd because there's thousands lining the wharves and everybody's looking on. And they got in there and they grabbed the tea. That was your big moment, guy. Okay, you're gonna throw it in the water, okay? Can you lift it? 400 pounds. I think you went far with it. Anyway. I think we're out of fun. We got a good fun. Thank you. You can go back and sit down. You helped save America. Okay. When word got back to England, and a fast schooner could make it in about 6 weeks, I think, the king was livid. I mean, he was still in his night clothes when he got the message, and he immediately called his ministers together. And boy, he was reading them a riot act. And he took off his night clothes and he threw it. And when he finished, he took off his underwear and threw it in the faces of his ministers. He's standing there with nothing on. That was not what I would call royal behavior, but as I said, he was slipping a little bit over the edge. And he answered that, of course, by sending several thousand more troops to Boston. And we go a couple more years, and Massachusetts is a hotbed of turmoil. General Gage knows something. He sends a bunch of guys out to the powder magazine, and he steals all the powder out of there. And the Patriots, who had access to the powder magazine, because every farmer had a musket. Everybody had guns. He stole all the powder and locked it up in a government warehouse. And the Patriots were just fuming mad. And he was all set to march off to Worcester, 40 miles away, because he heard that they were caching all kinds of guns and powder and cannon and everything. And he said, God, if I send a troop off to Worcester, he said, these guys, there's spies everywhere. I got spies, they got spies. There's no secrets in Boston. So he said, if I try to send a force marching off to Worcester, he said, their circuit riders will be there a day before my guys are, and there'll be nothing there when we get there. So he planned and he thought by himself. He didn't share this information with anybody. One of his spies said, hey, General, I hear they're caching a lot of stuff in Concord, 18 miles away. So I can get there in one night. So he put this plan in place where he would send 700 crack regulars and grenadiers, leaving at 10 o'clock at night. They would march all night. And they would get to Lexington. He had a secondary purpose too. He was looking for Paul Revere, and he was looking for me. And we were hiding out in Lexington. We were living with the minister. Okay? So he didn't tell a single man until earlier that night. And he called one of his officers in. He says, this is the plan. You're the first man I have told. This has to be kept secret. Okay? So he had already put the plan in force by not telling the Army or the Navy. He put those 700 men on easy duty about 4 or 5 days before. Then he told the admiral of the fleet, who hated him, the guy was corrupt, he was a bad guy. But he said, I want you to lower every longboat in the harbor and have it ready to be on the shore of the Charles River at 10 o'clock that night. Okay. Turned out there was only 20 of them showed up. Huh? Yeah. Okay. Well, when the man walked away from his meeting with General Gage, he walked by the Boston Common, and a couple of the old boys say, hey, the word's out. You guys have missed your mark. The riders are already on the road headed down. He said, wait a minute. He told me he never told another man. But he had told another woman. And her doctor was Dr. Joseph Warren, who just happened to be a very highly placed principal in the Sons of Liberty. So he gets word to Paul Revere, who has already put in place a plan.
Where's the box?
They didn't know if the British were going to go by land or by sea. By sea, that means across the Charles River to Charleston and then up the Lexington Road. So he devised this plan where he would send 2 men up with lanterns into the steeple of the Christ Church. This was an Anglican church. It was the tallest building in Boston at the time. And the Christ Church, unfortunately, the deacon, the head guy there, was a flaming loyalist. Okay? But the guy had a problem because he's preaching politics from the pulpit and not traditional religious messages. So people quit going to his church. And the elders in the church in Boston said, well, you're doing a bad job. Locked that church up, and they cut off his pay and kicked him out. But the vestryman, the guy who was in charge of keeping it clean and everything, as you would expect, Paul Revere knew everybody in town. And this guy was a loyalist. So he said, when I get the word that the British are on the move, I need you to get up in that tower with 2 lanterns. And if we know they're going by the Boston Neck, the ground route, wave 1 lantern. And 2, if they're going to cross the Charles River to Charleston and go up the Lexington Road. Well, when he saw all the longboats being put into the water and kind of taken over to the shoreline of the Charles River, he kind of knew they're going by sea. They're going by water. So that night, about the time as Paul Revere is headed down to the Charles River to a boat which is waiting for him to row him across. It's about 800 yards, I think. But the British fleet is throughout the bay. They have to do it quietly, remember. These 2 guys, the vestrymen, they go to the church, they go in. They had stashed their lights about this big, and they had a big candle in them. And they secured them around their neck with a metal thong, and they went up 154 stairs. And then they put a ladder up to get into the highest nook that they could still open the window to the northwest. And they sparked those 2 candles. Now, they don't have matches at this time, but they had flint and some tinder. And they sparked the tinder, blew it just enough to light the 2 candles, and they hung the 2 candles out the window like this. And immediately, patriots on the other side of the river signaled back with 1. That quickly, they blew them out. Those 2 lanterns probably weren't lit for 30 seconds. Okay? Paul Revere. He gets down to the harbor ahead of the British troops. Okay? They were...
I'm gonna bring him back up.
Yeah, our friend Paul.
He lived right down the street from the old North Church, if you've ever been to Boston.
It's called the Old North Church by tradition, but it was the Christ Church. It was an Anglican church. Today it's an Episcopal church, but things change.
It's still used as a church though.
Oh yeah, the Episcopals run the show there now. There aren't many Anglicans left. You've got the Protestants are a lot of Protestants, the Methodists and the Presbyterians and so forth and so on. There was no Jewish temple in Boston at the time. Believe it or not, the Catholics had built a church just 2 years before the American Revolution started. There weren't many Catholics in Boston, but as a result of the French and Indian War, Britain got Quebec, where there were 10,000 Catholics, and some of them began to filter down. But the Anglicans were a tough breed. They didn't like having these other guys. Okay, the first Jewish guy to get to Boston, he arrived in 1664. His name was Solomon Flacco. And he was sent on a ship that was consigned to deliver goods. And he thought, well, hey, this sounds like a nice place to live. I'll get off. But he found out real fast they didn't want him. So they kicked him out. But you just don't get on an airplane and fly back to England. But they were fairly nice about it. They gave him 16 shillings a day to put him up in a boarding house for about 6 weeks, where he got fed. Okay? And then they put him on a boat and sent him back east across the ocean. Okay, Paul Revere gets down to the waterfront. There's two guys waiting with a rowboat, but there's a problem. They get in, and the oarlocks are all dried up, and they squeak, squeak. How are you going to row through the British fleet making that siren noise? So they go up, they knock on a few windows. There are a lot of brick houses, buildings along. And there was a young lassie up on the second floor. And she looked at me and says, "Hey, what do you want?" He said, "Be you loyal or be you patriot?" She said, "I'm a patriot." She was very, he said, yeah, she was very patriot, very strong-willed woman, young woman. And they said, "We need a few shards of cloth to wrap around the oarlocks because they're making a squeaking noise." And a few moments later, she took off her petticoat. Yeah, this is always difficult for fifth graders because they don't know what a petticoat is. Anyway, and she throws it over the side. And they're very grateful, and they start tearing shards out, okay? And a few moments later, some woolen undergarments come flying over. Okay, I will tell you to a certainty. I opened it up for questions at the end, and somebody, some kid in the house, "Oh, is she wearing woolen?" No, she's not wearing it. I don't think. How would I know? Scratchy woolen underwear. I can't believe it. So they successfully go across the Charles River through the British fleet. And waiting there are some of his fellow conspirators, Sons of Liberty. And they have a fine mare, a horse, well-bred mare. The name was Brown Beauty. The only thing was, they didn't tell the owner that they had took his horse. So Paul Revere jumped on the horse and we're riding out to Lexington. Now, I'm going to ask you as loyal patriots, can we say a nation was saved on the strength of some lassie's underwear and a stolen horse? Maybe, who knows? Well, he's galloping along, and then he looks, and under a tree, he sees there's two redcoats. And of course, they step out on the road and want him to stop. Well, he rears the horse around, and he scampers off. And Brown Beauty, these guys are on a couple old plug horses. They're no match for Brown Beauty. And so he has to go up on the Mystic Road. He can't ride the Lexington Road because now he knows it's got guards and sentries on it. The Mystic Road was the next one up, but it would take him longer. Now, contrary to a lot of people, he didn't run through every village in Middlesex town, yelling, "The British are coming." Even Longfellow didn't say that. His mission was to get to Lexington and alert the militia there, and then get to Concord and alert the militia there that General Gage has sent 700 troops, okay? But his job was also to alert all these little farmhouses along that these guys were coming. So he didn't go barreling into towns yelling and screaming, but he did spread the word. But now, Paul Revere had established a great system of networking, probably the first in the United States, because he went to one little farmhouse and two guys would go off on horses, and they'd go to two, and then four guys would go off. And by the time the day played out, there were over 4,000 patriots, militiamen, minutemen, swarming down on Concord and Lexington. He got to Lexington, and he got to the minister's house, and he met with Hancock, and I was there. Okay, they decided they'd go to the Buckman Tavern, which is adjacent to the Lexington Green, if you've been there. It's painted yellow, it's a beautiful building. Now, there was another circuit rider out that night who had gone by the land route called the Boston Neck. His name was William Dawes. He was a tanner by profession, but he was loyal to the patriot cause. And he got there about an hour after Paul Revere did. And they had a small libation in the tavern. And it was decided the two of them would ride to Concord. So they went outside, they mounted up. It was only 6 more miles down to Concord. And they met up with a young doctor. His name was Prescott. And he'd been in town to see his sweetheart, the love of his life. They hoped to be married. Her name was Mulligan, I believe. Lydia Mulligan, I believe. And he knew all the back road. He knew, yeah, he says, I know, let's go to Concord. I'll ride with you. So the three of them go galloping off. They only get about 3 miles down the road when they are stopped by 10 redcoats. They're captured. And Prescott leans over and he says, get ready, boys. Get on! And they spur their horses. And Prescott, he's on a fine horse. He goes and he jumps a block wall and heads off into the bush, and he gets away. He gets to Concord. Paul Revere gets captured. He's not too good of a horseman. William Dawes, he turns his mount around and he's scampering back to Lexington, but he falls off his horse. He loses his watch, but they're still chasing him, but he manages to scamper into the woods and he doesn't get caught, but he has to walk on foot back to Lexington. Now, they turn their attention to Paul Revere, and he says, I'm an honest man. I'll tell you exactly what I was doing. And he did. He said, furthermore, I will tell you there are 700 troops marching into Lexington here within a short time, and they'll be marching through here to Concord. And there was also dispatch riders swarming over the countryside who will have hundreds, if not thousands, here by morning. And if you fear for your lives, it would be best if you go back to Lexington and meet the troops that are coming. And they believed him. And suddenly heard a volley of shots from Lexington. And it was the Lexington militia. There was only, I think, 77 of them. They were clearing their muskets. And then they reloaded and they took up positions in front of the trees and the brush on the west end of Lexington Green. Okay. And they heard the shooting and they said, he must be talking, good stuff. And they didn't want to have to face 1,000 of these militiamen swarming all over the place. So the first thing they did, they stole his horse. Brown Beauty changed her, Brown Beauty changed her political alliance from patriot to loyal. And a rather portly soldier got on. And not to get too far ahead, but on the run back to Boston, Brown Beauty expired. She had ridden hard and fast all night. It was just too much for her. Okay, now we have the incident at the North Concord Bridge. This is the one that was immortalized by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote, by the bridge that arcs the flood, the flag furled in April's breeze, the embattled farmers stood ready and fired the shot heard round the world. No, Ralph. The first shot was fired on Lexington Green about 3 hours before. The British arrived in Lexington before Concord. And 8 Patriots died. Only one English regular took a ball through the cheek. That was the only injury. They were pretty happy with themselves, those guys, and they went scampering off to Concord. Meanwhile, about 400 of the Patriot riders had assembled on a hill across the Concord River up on the side of the hill. And Colonel Smith, who was a portly fellow, not real bright, but he'd been selected as the guy in charge of this English operation of General Gage's. He sent a group of men to the Concord Bridge. And I think 4 units crossed over the bridge. They were to go 2 miles because they had been told that there were no more arms in Concord. And there weren't, because the word had got there. They had spirited everything out into the farms, the countryside. And about 80 of the regulars would stay on the Concord side of the river in ranks on each side of the bridge. And now several groups of redcoats had crossed over the bridge and disappeared in the distance. Now you have these 80 redcoats and they're looking up at the hill and they said, hey, there's a bunch of guys up there. A bunch of guys. And so the commander up there, he said, let's go down and take ranks on our side of the river. So they get down there and they're facing each other. What are you going to do? Each side had been told, don't fire unless somebody else fires. Well, apparently some redcoat got antsy and he fired. 2 of the Patriots of these 400 guys were killed. And of course, the fusillade that came from the Patriot side sent all these redcoats scampering behind rocks and trees and everything. 3 of them would die, and 4 out of their 8 officers were seriously wounded. Remember I told you about those uniforms? Everybody knew. The guy in the bright red one, he's the guy you want to shoot first. So that's what they did. And this later played out at the Battle of Bunker Hill when the British lost 90 officers. Okay, so the redcoats, they got up and started to scamper back to Lexington. And I'm sorry, to Concord, where the others were all milling around, going through. They burned down a building or 2. They couldn't find any arms. They couldn't find any gunpowder. And as they're running back, Colonel Smith said, hey, what's going on here? Where are you coming? What's going on? And they said, well, there's too many of them. And so he said, no, turn around. He raised his sword, turn around. And he got a bunch of other guys, and they all went over there. But the Americans had kind of retreated. And then they came down again and chased all the rest of those redcoats that had assembled, chased them all back to Concord. And I mean, they were picking them off like rabbits. He said, these patriots, these guys don't fight fair. They're hiding behind every tree and every rock. They were bushfighters. They had fought in the French and Indian War. They had learned from the Indians. The British all wanted to come down and all line up, and the front line would kneel down, fire, and back up, and the next line. Yeah, what? That wasn't the way it was done in this side of the Atlantic Ocean. Well, they got back to Concord, and Colonel Smith had made one rather good move. When he was halfway down the Lexington Road that night, church bells were ringing everywhere. There were watchfires on every hill. He knew he was in deep stuff. So he said, hey, go back to General Gage. Tell him we're going to need some more men down here. He says, this is getting pretty heavy down here. So the writer had gone back, and General Gage sent another 1,000 men. And now they're coming down the road, and they meet up with Colonel Church and Smith. I don't say Church all the time, Smith. And his men are really almost on a dead run to get back to Lexington. They want to get out of here because it is hot in Concord, and they're getting picked off right and left. And there was one rather tragic incident. One of the redcoats who had been wounded in the first, he slumped down on the bridge, and he was still alive, but he was in bad shape. They grabbed most of their wounded and when they ran and carried him off, but they didn't get this one guy. And there was a 13-year-old boy who came down, and he's, after everything had cleared and got headed off to Concord, 13-year-old boy came by, and he saw this guy. So he got an axe and he whacked him in the head and killed him. And shortly after that, that group of redcoats that had gone 2 miles inland looking for stuff, they never found anything. They're coming back and they find this poor individual who'd been whacked with an axe on the Concord Bridge. In fact, they were supposed to tear up the bridge, but they didn't wait for that. They took up a few planks, but they could still cross, and they went back to Concord. And now the British are in full retreat, And it's not going well. And because the rumor or the word spread about this atrocity on the bridge, they're really angry, and they're shooting farmers and their wives and kids, and they're burning buildings. And yet they keep heading back. And on the ridges, the Patriots are pacing them, shooting down on them. And the next guy, we got to tell an interesting story about Samuel Whittemore. He's my hero. The oldest hero of the Revolutionary War. The man was 80 years old. He'd fought in the French and Indian War. He lived in the town of Monotony. That town doesn't exist anymore. It's now called Arlington, Massachusetts. He had a farm, family. He's 80 years old. In the French and Indian War, he had collected 2 French dueling pistols and a French saber. That, along with his musket, was over the fireplace in his house, his cabin. And he knew what was going on. He saw all these redcoats. Some of them were now white coats because they had taken off their red coats and thrown them away because they were getting shot at with red coats. He decided he was going to do his part for the Patriots. So he loaded up his 2 French dueling pistols, stuck them in his belt, lashed on his French dueling or saber or whatever it was, sword. And then he loaded up his musket. Now in those days, you only got 1 shot. There was no repeating rifles or anything. So his wife says, "Sam, you silly old fool, what are you doing?" He said, "I'm going down to the road." So he went down to the road and he hid behind a rock. And pretty soon, a scruffy bunch of these redcoats were coming down the road. And he stepped out in front of them with his musket. Bam! He dropped the front one. He was dead before he hit the ground. Then he pulled out his 2 pistols. Bam! You're fatally wounded. You ain't gonna make it home. Bam! Killed the 3rd one. But he's out of bullet or balls or whatever. So now he gets his sword out. And only now do they realize, they're all looking back, or they're chasing us, and now they got this funny old coot on the road who's shooting at them from front. So they turn around, and remember, they've only got 1 shot. So they go bam, 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 bam. Well, he gets hit 3 times. Cheek, shoulder, leg. and the last one knocks him to the ground. And it's been a wet spring, okay? And the ground, the mud in the road, and he's writhing around, and they run up to him with their bayonets. And he got one of them really good on the leg. The guy probably lived the rest of his life. They stabbed him 13 times. Poor old Sam. And then they kept moving on. Some of the fiercest fighting was in Monotony on the way home. 47, 43, 47. 40-some of the Redcoats were killed in Monotony alone. There was a total of 79, I think, in the whole deal. And of course, his wife and, you know, some of the farmer ranchers, they came down, oh, Sam, you silly old man. And Sam's still alive. He's twitching there on the, oh my God, he's still alive. So one of the guys, he pulls a door off one of the farm buildings right there, and they make a litter. And they take him to the Cooper Tavern, which is now kind of a triage center. They got wounded guys in there, some wearing red coats, some of them just farmers, some of them Minutemen, whatever. They take Sam in and they lay him out on a table. He's a mess. He's full of blood and full of mud, but he's still alive. Amazing. And the doctor comes up, tries to clean him up a little bit. He turns to Sam's wife and said, I think it's best you call the man over there, the man with the black hat and the black coat, Undertaker. Undertaker. So she does. And the man comes over, you know, he looks over Sam, and he starts measuring him for a casket. It's terrible. And Sam's wife says, please, kind sir, you know, we're simple folk. We don't have a lot of money. And so the guy whispers a price to her. And laying on the table, Sam says, too much, don't pay him. I love this guy. The doctor says, clean him up, take him home, let him die in his own bed. So they do. They take him home and they lay him down in his bed, and then it's pretty late in the afternoon by now, and they all go out and they gather around the table to pray. And pretty soon they hear a knocking on the wall. Hey, I'm pretty hungry in there. Is anybody get to dinner? Oh, quickly. So they get some porridge together or something. And he has something to eat and slips away in sleep. Sleep, not death. Early the next morning, here he is knocking on the wall again. Does anybody can do breakfast around here? Sam Whittemore lived another 18 years.
Was that?
He died at the age of 98. Now, when I was back researching a lot of this material in Boston, I had a friend I was in the Navy with who lived in Worcester. And he took me all along the Lexington Road. We saw Concord, we saw Lexington, we saw all this stuff. And I told him, I said, Fran, I want to go to the old burial ground because that's where Sam Whittemore lies. And we went there. It's still there. But, you know, they have a problem back there. Many of those gravestones were slate. That's a soft rock. And it's getting really hard to read them. But we did find them. And as I like to do to many forgotten people who I deserve to be remembered, I laid a single red rose at the foot of his grave and said, Sam, you're quite a guy. Thank you for your part in the American Revolution. Okay, I got a few closing notes if I can get my foot out from this chair. Yeah, I will a minute. About 3 months later, the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was fought on Breed's Hill. Bunker Hill was the next hill over. Bunker Hill was taller than Breed's Hill, but the Patriots defended it bravely. The British massed troops, they made 3 runs up and 3 times they were repulsed. The 4th time they finally drove the Patriots off. Sadly, Dr. Joseph Warren, he had decided to take up ranks as a simple fighter. He was an officer, highly ranked, and he was shot and killed on Breed's Hill. And he and another fellow who fell close to him were tossed into a common grave. 11 months later, his family went up. They had an idea of where he was buried, and they dug up his body, which was pretty much unrecognizable at the time. But he had some dental work. Now, Paul Revere, who was an amazing fellow, about 5 or 6 years before all this all transpired, he was going broke because of the taxes and tariffs placed on copper and silver and all the things he used in his trade. He needed to find some method of income. So he went to his friend, the same Dr. Joseph Warren, and he learned some simple dentistry. In fact, Dr. Joseph Warren, he had a tooth problem, which Paul Revere pulled and put a fake tooth in there and wired it in. Okay? Now, when the body was dug out, they called Paul Revere. He said, do you recognize, for the first time in American history, forensic dental technology played out?
Wow.
Paul Revere said, I put that fake tooth in there. That's my wire. So they were able to identify the man. And he's buried in downtown Boston, I believe. Probably at the Granary. I think that's where I'm buried now. I don't know. I don't remember the incident. I was 83 years old. I actually, as Sam, I actually came back and served 3 terms as the governor of the state of Massachusetts. Okay, I believe I saw 3 presidents seated. That would have been Washington, my second cousin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. One other closing note on, where's my mug?
It's over there at the end of the table.
Oh, I have to get my mug here. Okay, last Samuel Adams. 1984, the Boston Brewing Company decided to come out with a special brew. They called it Samuel Adams Boston Lager. You've all seen the commercials. You've all seen that resolute old guy standing there with a mug. Okay? But the advertising agency had a problem. You see, I'm not very good looking. Old Sam, I mean, he's as ugly as a mud fence. Okay? They couldn't put him on the AdWorks. Well, there were no photographs at the time, so they went around looking for pictures that might fill the bill. So my friends, when you see that ad, you'll be looking into the face, not of Samuel Adams, but believe it or not, Paul Revere. That is a secret they don't want told. Okay, I do have a few notes on flags. Are we okay on time?
Yes, please.
What are your?
Okay. Another comment one of my famous authors made was Ralph Waldo. He said the embattled farmers with their flags unfurled. They didn't have any flags. Okay? They all had the same flag. The British flag looked like this, only instead of red and white stripes, it was all red. That was the one that was common in Massachusetts at the time. But when the Patriots got going, what they did is they got 6 pieces of white cloth and simply sewed white stripes onto what had been the Grand Union flag. Okay, the canton, which is this area of the flag, remained British because they were still British. Okay. Then another flag that came into popular usage. Well, let's go with this one first. This is the join or die flag. This was a cartoon that Ben Franklin did.
You have it upside down?
Do I? Yes, I do. I think so.
There we go.
There we go. It showed this segment and saying it was used as a cartoon in the Philadelphia Gazette, which was Ben Franklin's newspaper. It was a cartoon that he drew, and it symbolized a snake that had been cut into parts. And each part, or many of the parts, were listed as the state or the colonies at the time. And he is saying, we have to join together in this fight in the French Canadian War.
Was any New England?
It was New England. They grouped those states up there. Yes. And a couple of states are missing. Some of they didn't get them all. Okay. This is the Gadsden flag that came into popular usage. Now, you students among us will notice there's no apostrophe between the N and T and don't. The apostrophe really hadn't been invented yet. It certainly hadn't come into common usage. So it is, in fact, exactly the way the flag appeared in 1775.
Do you think that one came because of the Benjamin Franklin one?
Pardon?
Do you think that came about because of the Benjamin
Yeah, they
Franklin?
had a thing for rattlesnakes.
Uniquely American.
Yes.
Defensive.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
I got a couple others here I want to show you.
Which one?
Well, we're going to do all of them. This is the Betsy Ross flag. Now, the book is still out. Did Betsy Ross really make this flag or not? We don't know. But according to popular story, she went to church in Philadelphia, where she lived. And sitting in the next box was George Washington. And he leaned over and said, "Hey, Betsy, can you make me a flag?" She owned an upholstery store. There were 19 upholstery stores in Philadelphia at the time, but anyway, he found Betsy. And he handed her a drawing. The only thing different about it, he had used a 6-pointed star. And Betsy didn't like that. She said, "Let me show you a trick." She took some paper and she folded it up and she went, "Stuff it, stuff it." She opened it up to a perfect 5-point star. And he said, "You know, I like that. All the other flags in the world were 6 points." He said, "I like that." So we ended up with 5-point star. And the tradition is carried on ever since. Okay, just hold that one up. I like to show my flag. I got twice as many flags. I didn't bring them home. Here we're into rattlesnakes again. This flag,
It's a good looking flag.
yeah,
Utah there.
yeah. This flag was probably the first naval flag of the Continental Navy. It came about probably fall of 75. Anyway, and back to the "Don't Tread on Me" and our French rattlesnake, okay? I have another interesting flag. No, we'll show that one. Where's the Serapis flag?
I don't have any more. Is there? Oh, okay.
This is a little known story.
I think that's interesting stars.
Yeah,
What do we got? 8-pointed.
stars.
yeah. Well, do we all remember John Paul Jones?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and his ship, the Bonhomme Richard, they were basically a raider, just wreaking havoc on the coast of Britain. they were raiding these small towns, going in there and driving the people crazy. They didn't have telephones or internet or anything, so you know the word didn't get around. They'd swoop in on a town and stuff, and they were off the coast in the English Channel, and suddenly they encountered this big 5-star warship of the Brits. It's called the HMS, the Serapis, and the two ships clashed, and they actually went side by side. They're tied together, and the Bonhomme Richard is sinking, and they're firing shell or balls into each other and everything. And the Serapis hit the captain yells over. He says, "Get off your flag!" And John Paul Jones says, "I have not yet begun to fight." But his ship sank from under him. So all his men jumped on the ship, and they beat up all of the British sailors. And they took control of the Serapis. Okay? But the Serapis was kind of shot up pretty good too. But the big problem was, and they didn't realize at the time, when the Bonhomme Richard went down, the Continental flag, I saw one with a snake on it or whatever, it went down. So there was no marking, because they struck the colors on the British ship. So now that ship had no flag. So they said, well, we got to get into some port. So they went into a Dutch port because they were neutral. And the Dutch said, oh, no flag. The guy must be a pirate. Well, you take pirates and hang them. No, wait, you don't understand. I'm an officer in the Continental Navy. And fortunately, there was somebody there who said, well, he might be telling the truth. But you know what? This guy, Ben Franklin, is down in Paris right now. Let's send a message down there and see if he'll vouch for this guy. So they did. And Ben Franklin, they have a copy of it. He sketched out a flag. He didn't know what the flags looked like. There was no official, he didn't know. So he sketched out this flag. And he sent back, yes, here's a flag. So anyway, they sewed him a flag, and now John Paul Jones was freed. The Brits are hammering the Dutch. We want that guy. Well, the Dutch didn't turn him over. This is called the Serapis flag. It didn't hang around very long, but it got our boy John Paul off.
That's a good story.
They never told me that in school. I don't know why they don't tell me these things. The last one. This is the Star Spangled Banner. I still have one more. I think I have the Utah state flag with 45 stars on it. This is the Star Spangled Banner. See anything different on this one?
15.
Somebody count the
Got a
stripes.
lot of stripes.
Yeah. Okay. When our country was first formed, the deal was they were going to add a star and a stripe. Okay? Well, we had two new states come on board, Kentucky and Vermont. So they added 2 stripes at the bottom. But then some smart guy said, there's a whole lot of room out here in the West. And pretty soon this flag's going to cover up your driveway. So they went back to 13 stripes, but we did continue to add a star. Now, it didn't happen for every single state. I think there's been like 28 different American flags, because a lot of times Arizona and New Mexico came in at the same time. They're the 47th, 48th flag. I think Alaska came in with 49. Of course, yeah. Is this the Utah?
I hope so.
I think this is the Utah flag.
What?
On the 3rd of January in 1896, Utah became a state. The federal government authorized this flag on the 4th of July of that year. And it flew for 12 years over 3 presidents. Teddy Roosevelt being one of them.
Is that another one?
put in the tabernacle when they were
Did they put one in a time
celebrating
capsule or
the-
something?
the like I know they draped a huge flag on the ceiling. Is that what they did?
I don't know. I have a friend, and his name is Brent Ashford. Ashford.
Ashworth,
Do you know Brent?
minute.
This guy's fantastic collector of historic memorabilia.
Yeah.
He has one of the original 13-star flags that flew over the Capitol. The other thing, I've held it in hand too. When the Pilgrims all arrived in 1620, they were all working with the Geneva Bible. In the 1500s, it came out with the King James Version, but it wasn't really accepted, particularly for those folks, because they were mad at the Anglican Church anyway. But Brett has Governor Bradford's Geneva Bible. It's not real big. It's only about this big. I held it in my hand.
What a treasure.
I don't know what that thing's. I bet his collection is worth got to be $4 or $5 million. He's got Lincoln's autograph. He's got an incredible. I was researching a story on Butch Cassidy. He's got some original letters that Butch Cassidy wrote to his mother. I don't know where this guy gets this stuff. Incredible.
He has
Yes. How ironic that those things are worth so much money now. And they're forgeries. You know where he got the paper for those forgeries?
Special collection.
Huh?
Special collection.
The U.
Yeah.
He'd go up with a razor and he'd cut it off. Now he had a piece of paper that was dated.
It's already copied.
Yeah. Anyway, I do have some books that I do write books for fun. If anybody is interested, you're welcome to come up and I'll answer any questions. And if you choose to buy one, I'll certainly autograph it for you. And with that, I guess the presentation is through. I do thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.